In 1786, Michel Gabriel Paccard and his companion Jacques Balmat were the first to ascend Mont Blanc. This event led to the rapid development of mountaineering as a sport and form of active recreation. Since then, thousands of people climb mountain peaks around the world each year, setting new records, making scientific discoveries, and overcoming personal fears. But not every ascent ends in triumph. In this video, I will tell the stories of those climbers whose desire to touch the sky turned into tragedy. Natalyia Nagavitsina is a Russian mountaineer born in the town of Lysva in the Perm region. In 2016, she became interested in mountaineering, and over 9 years she participated in more than 30 ascents, also personally leading an expedition to Elbrus. One of the woman's most significant achievements is climbing Peak Communism, which reaches a height of 7.5 kilometers. Natalya's husband, Sergey Nagavitsin, shared her passion, and they often practiced climbing together. Their last joint adventure was an ascent of Khan Tengri in 2021. At first, everything went well, but at an altitude of 6,800 meters, the man suffered a stroke. When the rescue team reached the couple, it was too late. Sergey was paralyzed, and attempts to transport him were unsuccessful. Natalyia understood the gravity of the situation but refused to evacuate until her husband passed away. Despite what had happened, the woman did not give up her dangerous hobby. A year after Sergey's death, she returned to Khan Tengri to install a memorial plaque in his honor. In May 2025, the mountaineer set out to climb Tekator in Kyrgyzstan, located at an altitude of 4.5 kilometers. There, she and other members of the group were buried by rocks, which caused her to suffer a double leg fracture. This time, everything turned out well. The injured woman was urgently evacuated by helicopter and taken for treatment. 2 months after the injury, she joined an expedition to Victory Peak, considered the most dangerous of the 5 7,000ers in the post-Soviet space. Experienced climbers strongly refused to take Natalyia with them, as she did not have the proper preparation for such a difficult journey. However, she managed to persuade one of the guides to accompany her, and according to Alexander Pyotnitsyn, deputy head of the Russian Mountaineering Federation, she most likely hid from him the fact that she had recently suffered a double leg fracture. Otherwise, she would not have received permission for the ascent. On August 12th, Natalyia and her 3 companions, Roman Makrinsky, Luka Sinigali, and Gunther Sigmund, reached the summit of Victory Peak. As the group was descending, at an altitude of 7,200 meters, Roman lost his grip on the rock and, falling, dragged the woman down with him. During the fall, she suffered another leg fracture and was left unable to move. The expedition members provided the mountaineer with first aid, hastily set up a temporary camp, and left her with some supplies and gas. Upon reaching the base, they immediately informed the rescuers about what had happened. A day later, Natalyia was visited by Luka and Gunther. They brought her a sleeping bag, more food, and a burner to keep warm. Due to extreme weather conditions, the rescue team started their work several days later. It included Luka Sinigali, an experienced Italian climber who had ascended Victory Peak with the woman. He tried to help her twice on his own, but ultimately died from critical frostbite. Luka's death was not the end of the misfortunes. On August 17th, the Ministry of Defense of Kyrgyzstan sent a Mi-8 helicopter to assist the rescuers. However, the helicopter did not reach its destination. The crew had to make an emergency landing, during which the pilot suffered a spinal fracture, and his co-pilot seriously injured his pelvic bones. The rescuers had no choice but to monitor Natalyia using drones and hope for improved weather. On August 19th, a drone flew over the area where the mountaineer's torn tent stood and discovered that she was still alive, but in extremely critical condition. Several more attempts were made to reach her, but none were successful. On the 23rd, the Ministry of Emergency Situations announced to the media that the rescue operation had been suspended due to the threat of avalanches and a sharp deterioration in weather conditions. A few days later, specialists conducted a final reconnaissance using a drone and thermal imaging equipment, which revealed that the woman was no longer showing signs of life. The company Aksai Travel, which organized the expedition, publicly announced the death of the 47-year-old mountaineer and expressed condolences to her son. Representatives of the Kyrgyz Ministry of Emergency Situations stated that retrieving Natalya's body would not be possible until the spring of 2026. However, experts are skeptical, as none of the 80 climbers who died on Victory Peak before have ever been brought down from the summit. Nadezhda Oleneva was born in 1985 and began rock climbing at around the age of 20. However, unlike her fellow countrywoman Natalyia Nagavitsina, she decided to pursue it professionally, enrolling in the Central School of Mountaineering Instructors and graduating in 2017. Immediately after completing her studies, the woman opened her own club in Perm for mountain climbing enthusiasts, and 4 years later, she founded the trad climbing school Mountain Guru in St. Petersburg, which offers comprehensive training for mountaineers. Over 17 years, Nadezhda completed more than 200 ascents, repeatedly won medals in Russian championships in the rock class, was awarded the Crystal Peak and Steel Angel prizes, and also held the title of Master of Sports of Russia in mountaineering. She had many ideas for the development of domestic rock climbing and had several promising projects planned, but these plans were cut short due to a tragedy that occurred in Nepal. In 2023, Nadezhda Oleneva traveled to the Himalayas to climb the highest part of the Dhaulagiri mountain range together with Rasim Kashapov and Roman Abildayev. The group declined the services of local Sherpas, who assist climbers during expeditions and did not take supplemental oxygen with them. On October 14th, Nepalese media reported that at 8 hours and 46 minutes, the Russian climber lost her footing on an icy slope at an altitude of about 6,500 meters and fell into a crevasse. Rasim and Roman tried to locate her and help her get out on their own, but the weather conditions were far from ideal. They were forced to return to camp, where they immediately informed the Ministry of Emergency Situations that, according to GPS data, their 37-year-old companion was at a depth of 500 meters. Due to strong wind gusts, the rescue team began the search for the woman with a one-day delay. Carefully inspecting the accident site from a helicopter, Kashapov and Abildayev spotted Nadezhda, but it was impossible to reach her. Later, an avalanche occurred at the spot where the woman had fallen, rendering further search and rescue efforts unsuccessful. Her body remained buried under a multi-meter layer of ice and snow. It is impossible to say for certain whether the mountaineer survived the fall. Vladimir Shatayev, a well-known climbing coach of the Soviet Union, believes she may have had a chance despite the great depth of the crevasse. She might even have been saved if the worsening weather had not prevented the helicopter from landing, or at least lowering a rescuer on a winch. A year after the death of Nadezhda Oleneva in the Dhaulagiri Mountains, a group of 5 people led by 45-year-old Alexander Dusheiko, a candidate for Master of Sports and a mountaineering instructor, perished there. Along with him were other experienced climbers, Oleg Kruglov, Dmitry Shpilovoy, Mikhail Nosenko, and Russian musician Vladimir Chistikov. On October 5, 2024, Alexander wrote in his online blog that he and his companions were feeling great and ready to conquer the summit, after which the entire team left the camp. Valery Shamalo also set off with them, but at an altitude of 7,700 meters, he decided to turn back, as rapidly changing weather, increasing rockfalls, and sharp winds indicated that the climb would be dangerous. On October 6th, closer to midnight, Alexander Dusheiko and his companions stopped responding to messages. At first, no one panicked, since all the group members were well-trained and had experience with difficult climbs. But after 24 hours, their colleagues raised the alarm, and on the morning of October 8th, a plane took off from the rescue base to survey the mountain slopes. The men were located fairly quickly. Upon examining the site of the incident, it became clear that due to bad weather, they had been forced to deviate significantly from the main route, and during the descent at an altitude of 7,100 meters, they fell and died. According to official data, their deaths were caused by fatigue, a poorly chosen climbing strategy, and strong winds. Sometime later, the embassy of the Russian Federation in Nepal announced the successful evacuation of the climbers' bodies from the slopes of Dhaulagiri. On October 16th, they were brought to Kathmandu, from where they were later sent home for burial. Marc-André Leclerc was born in 1992 in Nanaimo, the second-largest city on Vancouver Island in Canada. Thanks to his grandfather, who gave him a copy of Christian Bonington's book, Quest for Adventure, he started climbing rocks at the age of 8, and by 15 had joined the Alpine Club of British Columbia. Being part of this organization helped him develop as a climber, participate in numerous competitions, and even win the Canadian Championship in 2005. Despite his success in mountaineering, Marc-André was not driven by awards, titles, or records. He simply enjoyed spending time in the mountains, admiring the scenery, and embracing the silence. In 2015, he traveled to Patagonia and soloed a challenging 1,200-meter route on Cerro Torre. A year later, undeterred by snow and cold, he climbed Torre Egger in Argentina without outside support. The young mountain conqueror often climbed without a rope, was unafraid of extreme conditions, and inspired admiration among seasoned climbers. American rock climber Alex Honnold and Rolando Garibaldi, a well-known Argentine mountain guide, described him as one of the most remarkable young talents, noting his endurance, courage, and devotion to his passion. But unfortunately, even the bravest are not immune to tragedy. In March 2018, Marc-André Leclerc and his partner Ryan Johnson traveled to Alaska to climb to the summit of the northern section of the Mendenhall Glacier. On the 5th, they successfully completed a relatively new route and reached their target destination. At the summit, Marc-André sent text messages to his mother Michelle Kuipers and his beloved partner Brett Harrington. After that, all communication with both men ceased. Due to unstable weather conditions, the search for the climbers began only on March 8th. For several days, rescuers scoured the mountains, but the only items they found were skis and accompanying gear that the missing men had planned to use on their descent back to town. Initially, it was assumed that Marc-André and Ryan Johnson were simply stuck on a slope due to a sudden change in weather. Rescue teams patrolled the area near the glacier hourly by helicopter, but this yielded no results. Due to a strong storm, the search operation dragged on for a week. On March 13th, during another aerial scan of the slopes, rescuers discovered remnants of ropes disappearing into a crevasse. Family and friends of the climbers confirmed that they resembled the accessory cords the men had taken on their expedition. The next day, Marc-André's father, Sergey Leclerc, announced the death of his son and Ryan on his personal Facebook page. He thanked everyone who had taken part in the search, prayed for them, and hoped for a good outcome. A day later, emergency services officially confirmed the men's deaths and announced that, due to avalanche risk and other factors, all attempts to recover their bodies had been suspended. The story of the courageous Marc-André touched many hearts. Memorial services were held around the world, and tributes were erected in his honor. Admirers of the young man also created a website with his photographs to preserve his memory and inspire future generations of climbers to achieve great things. In 2021, the documentary film The Alpinist, directed by Peter Mortimer and Nick Rosen, premiered. It tells the story of Marc-André Leclerc, his passion, and his achievements in the sport. Work on the project began during the climber's lifetime. Between 2015 and 2016, he traversed challenging routes with the film crew and gifted the world with breathtaking footage of mountain summits. The film served as a posthumous tribute to the fallen young man, received widespread praise from both general audiences and professional critics and the climbing community, and was awarded a Sports Emmy. On the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, it received 93% positive reviews, and the platform Metacritic gave it 67 points out of 100. Everest is the highest point on the planet, which for many years has attracted climbers from all over the world. According to data provided by the governments of Nepal and China, around 1,000 climbers arrive in the Himalayas each season, but only half of them reach the summit and return without serious incidents. The rest either fail to reach the goal due to fear or deteriorating health, or they perish without realizing their dream. One of those whose ascent to Everest ended in tragedy was David Sharp, a native of the English town of Harpenden. He had been passionate about climbing since youth and joined the University Mountaineering Club while studying at the University of Nottingham. After graduating as an engineer, David worked for a while at an international security company and then decided to follow his heart by completing teacher training. In the autumn of 2006, he was planning to begin teaching mathematics at a school, but his plans were never fulfilled. 3 months before the start of the school year, the man visited the Himalayas to make a solo ascent of Everest without supplemental oxygen. His friends knew this idea was extremely dangerous, even for incredibly experienced and acclimatized climbers such as the local Sherpa guides, but they did not stop their stubborn friend. Before the expedition, David signed a contract with the company Asian Trekking, which excluded any additional services once the client had been delivered to the advanced camp, located at an altitude of 6,300 meters. This meant that after arriving at base camp, David had to take care of himself. Before attempting the summit, he set up several intermediate camps, carefully checked his gear, and spent 5 days on the slope to help his body adjust to the new environmental conditions. Late on the evening of May 13th, Sharp set out on his ascent, taking with him a couple of oxygen canisters, which at high altitude last no more than 10 hours. He left his radio in the tent, depriving himself of the ability to call for help in case of emergency. During the night of May 13th to 14th, he stopped in the death zone at an altitude of 8,500 meters and set up camp near a limestone cave commonly known as Green Boots. At that point, his oxygen had likely run out, and altitude hypoxia had probably begun to develop. Sharp's distress was not immediately known at base camp, since he was climbing solo and no one was tracking his location. Among the first to find the man were members of the Indian Hymex expedition. At the time they encountered him, he was nearly unconscious, unresponsive to flashlight beams, but breathing well. Team member Mark Woodward believed the unfortunate man had slipped into hypothermic coma and saw no point in attempting resuscitation. After sending a message to base camp about the climber they had found, the group continued on their way. Later, Woodward explained his decision by saying he needed to prioritize the safety of his own team. Soon after, other climbers passed by the helpless David. None of them responded to the man lying in the snow, assuming he was already dead. Among those who saw the man but did not assist him was the film crew from Discovery Channel, who were filming a new season of the reality show Everest, Beyond the Limit that day. The public later condemned the crew for their perceived cynicism and cruelty because they filmed Sharp, who was on the verge of death, and simply left. In total, about 40 people passed by the dying man. Almost all of them showed indifference to the climber lying in the snow, and only one tried to help. That was Serhan Pokin, the leader of a Turkish group. He and his teammates visited the helpless man several times, but due to a lack of oxygen, were forced to return to camp at an accelerated pace. Early in the morning of May 15th, David Sharp died from hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. The media blamed the climbers who could have helped him but chose not to. David's mother, Linda Sharp, did not hold anyone accountable. In an interview with the Sunday Times, she said she was not angry at those who passed him by, because in such conditions, everyone must think only of themselves. The man's body remained in the same place until 2007. Afterward, at the request of his relatives, it was moved aside so that ascending climbers would no longer have to see it on their way to the top. Pyotr Kuznetsov was born in 1958 in the village of Proletarka in the Altai region. At the age of 18, he moved to Zheleznogorsk, got a job at the mining and chemical plant, and began attending the city's sports section. After 2 years of training, Pyotr earned the title of Candidate for Master of Sports and, for the first time in his life, visited the Jailik training base in the Caucasus, where he discovered mountaineering. The young man became so fond of climbing mountain slopes that after several years of dedicated practice, he became the head of his city's team and started regularly participating in mountaineering competitions. After the team led by Kuznetsov won the national championship in 1989, he and several of his teammates agreed to travel to the Himalayas in the near future to climb their first 8,000er, Cho-Oyu. In 1991, Pyotr joined an expedition led by Sergey Yefimov, but was unable to reach the summit. However, sometime later, he made a second attempt to climb above 8,000 meters, this time as part of Nikolai Zakharov's group. Over the following 10 years, the man participated in 6 expeditions in the Himalayas, summited Everest, was the first to climb Lhotse Middle, for which the President of Russia awarded him the Medal of the Order for merit to the fatherland, and even visited mountain regions of Antarctica with a scientific sporting team. In 2006, Kuznetsov became a member of the K2 Kuzbas expedition, organized with the support of Aman-Tuleyev, the head of the Kemerovo region. In addition to him, the team included 6 more people, including coach Alexander Voit and Novosibirsk doctor Sergey Naumenko. The climbers were to ascend the second highest peak on the planet, Chogory, better known as K2. It had drawn Pyotr's attention for many years, and he had even visited it a year earlier, though he decided against the climb at that time due to difficult weather conditions. On June 29th, the expedition members set up camp and began preparing for the challenging journey. 2 days later, divided into groups led by Alexander Voit and Pyotr Kuznetsov, they set off. Unfortunately, the weather conditions were not favorable for the ascent of K2. On August 3rd, Voit and his companions returned to one of the camps they had established along the route. Kuznetsov and his group refused to descend and decided to wait until the snowfall stopped. According to those who were on Chogory at the time, the climbers waited a long time for the right moment. On August 13th, Kuznetsov, Voit, Uteshev, and Kuvakin left the intermediate camp and headed for the summit. At an altitude of approximately 8.5 kilometers, the unexpected happened. An avalanche came down the slope. Just 200 meters from the goal, a mixture of ice, rocks, and snow instantly ended the lives of 4 men. When Pyotr and his companions failed to return at the appointed time, the remaining expedition members in the camp immediately raised the alarm. They contacted rescuers, but a search operation was denied, as it was deemed pointless to search for the deceased at such altitude in bad weather. Later, the climbers were declared missing, and the search for their bodies was discontinued. In 2010, an expedition from Kazakhstan that went to Chogory stumbled upon belongings that had belonged to Kuznetsov. Among them were camera equipment and a flashcard, which was reportedly still functional. Pyotr's death was a huge tragedy, not only for his family and 3 children, but also for all the residents of Zheleznogorsk, who took pride in the achievements of their fellow townsmen. The city authorities declared August 13th a day of remembrance for Kuznetsov, and in 2007, a monument was erected at the foot of K2 in honor of all the Russian climbers who died on that terrible day. Francys Yarbrough Di Stefano was born in 1958 in Hawaii and devoted almost her entire adult life to mountaineering. She completed many dangerous climbs and became known as the first American woman to ski down Mount Elbrus. In 1991, she traveled to the Himalayas as part of the Vysotnik expedition, where she met climber Sergey Arsentiev while resting at base camp. A year later, the couple got married. The Arsentievs traveled actively and conquered many peaks, including Goodwill Peak in the Tian Shan Range and the highest mountain in Alaska, Mount McKinley. In 1998, they went to Everest to climb its northern slope along with other mountaineers. Francys planned to make the ascent without using supplemental oxygen and become the first woman in American history to do so. On May 19th, the climbers reached the camp at an altitude of 8,200 meters and spent the night there. The next day, they made several attempts to reach the summit, but poor weather conditions prevented them. As a result, they spent 2 days in the camp without oxygen, which negatively affected their condition. Sometime later, instructor Anatoly Moshnikov visited the Arsentievs. He advised them to descend the next day, as remaining at such altitude any longer was dangerous. However, the couple did not heed his warning. On the 3rd night, they left the tent and headed for the summit of Everest without oxygen. Francys and Sergey were seen climbing the slope by renowned Uzbek mountaineer Rustam Rajabov. He noticed that they were exhausted and suffering from a lack of oxygen, so he tried to persuade them to turn back. However, the couple continued, and by 7 in the evening, they had reached the summit. With nightfall approaching, the Arsentievs began their descent, but they never made it back to the camp at 8,200 meters. On the morning of May 23rd, Uzbek climbers stumbled upon Sergey. The man seemed confused, repeatedly asked if they had found his wife, and was unable to explain how they had become separated. An hour after encountering him, The climbers found Francys. She was unconscious, but still breathing. They provided first aid, connected an oxygen bottle, and rubbed her frozen limbs. However, that was the extent of their help. The climbers left her behind and continued their ascent. On the way back down, the Uzbek climbers attempted to bring her lower, but without the necessary equipment at hand, they could not manage. The group's leader, Oleg Grigoriev, asked his teammates to inform Sergey that his wife had been found. He immediately grabbed oxygen canisters and headed toward her. Arsentiev relieved Oleg at Francys's side and, it is believed, spent the entire night with her. The next morning, Briton Ian Woodall and South African climber Cathy O'Dowd found the dying woman. Sergey was no longer there. The foreign climbers abandoned their Everest ascent and did everything they could to help Francys. For several hours, they tried to warm her, drag her down, and kept talking to her to prevent her from losing consciousness. However, Ian and Cathy eventually began freezing themselves and decided to return to camp. They tried to comfort Francys, telling her they would bring help, but she was already delirious and barely hearing them. The last thing she said was, "I am an American. Please don't leave me." Ian Woodall and Cathy O'Dowd spent a long time trying to persuade emergency crews to climb up and rescue Francys and search for her husband, but due to bad weather, no one dared ascend to that height. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, Francys died, and a few hours later, below the spot where her body lay, climbers found an ice axe that may have belonged to her husband. 9 years later, Ian and Cathy returned to Everest on a humanitarian mission to bury Francys and the unknown climber nicknamed Green Boots, who had died in 1996. They moved Francys's body away from the main route, wrapped it in an American flag, and placed a note from her son beside it. As for Sergey, his body has never been found. According to official records, he is still considered missing to this day. In the spring of 1996, the whole world was shocked by terrible news. During an ascent of Everest, several climbers died in front of hundreds of witnesses. This event became one of the most tragic in the history of mountaineering and cast doubt on the safety of expeditions organized by commercial companies. It all began when the company's adventure consultants and Mountain Madness offered several dozen people with varying levels of physical training a quick and comfortable ascent to the summit of Everest for a fixed fee. Within a short time, 2 teams of people wishing to reach the highest point on the planet were formed, led by experienced mountaineers Scott Fisher and Rob Hall. It was not their first time acting as guides, so they did not expect that something terrible could happen. On May 20th, the Adventure Consultants and Mountain Madness expeditions, along with other independent groups, began their ascent. Since this took place in the peak of the climbing season, a massive number of people were on the slope at the same time, causing a traffic jam on the route from the pass along the Nepal-China border. By dawn, bottlenecks had formed at difficult points. The largest crowd of climbers was recorded at the Hillary Step, a steep, nearly vertical section of the mountain about 13 meters high. Due to the significant delay, Rob Hall's team did not complete the ascent within the recommended time frame. According to safety guidelines, they were supposed to turn around and head back to camp by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Rob, who was known as a principled man who valued order, chose not to follow the rules this time. The reason he continued the climb was Doug Hansen, a client of Adventure Consultants who had paid a large sum of money for the chance to reach Everest's summit. After overcoming numerous difficulties, the group reached the top, but by that time most of the climbers were exhausted. Doug Hansen was in particularly poor condition, having run out of oxygen and feeling very unwell. Rob Hall decided to stay with him, while the others, seeing the approaching storm, hurried back to the intermediate camp. The Mountain Madness expedition also encountered serious trouble. Scott Fisher suddenly fell ill. Exhausted and showing signs of either cerebral or pulmonary edema, he nevertheless managed to reach the summit slope, but could not make it back to camp. Despite the support of Sherpa Lopsang Jangbu, Fisher got stuck at an altitude of 8,300 meters and ultimately died before help could reach him. On the evening of May 10th, a powerful storm began. Fierce winds, heavy snowfall, and a sudden drop in temperature to -40 degrees turned the descent into a living nightmare. Due to poor visibility, climbers lost their way, could not find landmarks in the darkness, and exhausted, lay down in the snow, where they quickly froze. That night, only a few were lucky enough to survive. Among those who managed to reach camp were climbers from Japan. Rob Hall and Doug Hansen were not among the fortunate ones. For an extended period, the two men remained at an altitude of 8,700 meters, freezing while maintaining radio contact with others. Rob even managed to speak one last time with his wife, who was in New Zealand preparing to give birth. When the storm subsided, Sherpas gathered supplies and set out to search for the missing climbers, but snowdrifts prevented them from progressing far. Later, Rob Hall, Scott Fisher, and 6 other climbers were found dead. This story caused a massive public outcry. The leadership of the commercial companies was blamed for prioritizing profit over human lives. In 1997, John Krakauer, who had been part of Rob Hall's expedition, wrote the book Into Thin Air. In it, he described in detail the horrors he experienced on that fateful day. Other survivors, including Anatoly Bukriv, Lou Kasishka, and Leen Gamelgard, also shared their memories. In 2015, the adventure film Everest, directed by Icelandic filmmaker Baltasar Kormákur, was released. It was based on the memoirs of Beck Weathers, a client of adventure consultants who miraculously survived the descent but suffered severe health consequences. He had fingers on his left hand, his right hand, and his nose amputated. Elena Bazykina was born in 1951 in Novaya Ladoga, Leningrad Oblast. After moving to Moscow with her parents, she enrolled at Moscow State University to study philology and discovered mountaineering during her time there. Realizing that exploring mountains interested her more than working in a government office, she joined a hiking club and spent all her free time trekking with friends. Bazykina's mother and father disapproved of her passion, but they couldn't keep their daughter at home. Every vacation, she would go traveling and frequently visited the mountains of Crimea, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Did Elena want to become a professional climber and earn awards or titles? Number. All she needed was freedom, loyal friends who affectionately called her Zaika, Little Bunny, and the chance to test her endurance. In 1987, at the age of 36, Bazykina set out with 5 members of her hiking club to climb the western summit of Mount Elbrus. On April 10th, the team arrived in Mineralnie Vody, a city north of Pyatigorsk, and then moved to base camp, where they began carefully preparing for the ascent. The climbers chose a route well tested by many, considered the safest, completed safety briefings, and began their climb. Sometime later, all contact with Bazykina's group was lost. Her friends who remained at the camp grew worried and alerted rescue services about a possible tragedy. The search operation began the same day, but a thorough inspection of the slopes and the plateau yielded no results. Attempts to find any of the hiking club members continued for a long time. Ultimately, all the young people were declared missing. Specialists were unable to determine the exact cause of their disappearance, but the main theory was that an avalanche had struck the climbers during their ascent. For 30 years, Elena's fate remained unknown, until everything changed in the summer of 2018, when an expedition led by Valery Melnikov set out to climb Elbrus. The climbers followed the same route that Bazykina and her companions had taken. At the time, the region was experiencing unusually warm weather, so they had to navigate thawed patches, exposed crevasses, and unstable glaciers. On the 7th day of the trek, at an altitude of 3,800 meters, someone in the group discovered a partially buried hiking backpack and next to it, the ice-covered remains of a person. Emergency workers who arrived at the site recovered body fragments, and based on documents found in the clothing, they identified the deceased as Elena Bazykina. This prompted a renewed search of the area to locate her fellow climbers, but the effort once again ended unsuccessfully. An examination of the remains revealed multiple fractures in the chest area, consistent with injuries caused by an avalanche. Everything that was left of Elena was handed over to Yevgeny Bazykin, her brother and only living relative. She had no husband or children, and her parents had passed away long ago, never learning the fate of their daughter. After a cremation procedure in Rostov, the woman's ashes were sent to Moscow and buried at Kovanskoye Cemetery, not far from the graves of her mother and father. Thus ended the story of a person who had been buried under the snows of Elbrus for 3 decades. And that's all for today. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. Your engagement is the best reward I could ask for. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye.